So my digital clock says that the big hand is on the 20 and the little hand is on the 15, and it's time to start the session. This is JMAP. What? Well, we'll get to that, I guess. So would anybody, I think we only need one person taking notes, and I am going to monitor the Jabber room while we're up here. Does anyone want to take notes for us, mostly keeping track of what the action items are and perhaps a little bit of the gist of the discussion? Not looking for detailed scribe. Oh, please. Someone, Harold, would you? Harold gave me a really bad look, so let's move on from that.
We've got someone right in the front row.
Yes, he has been very brave. We will not ask more of him. Joe Hildebrand will do it. Thank you so much, Joe. Okay, so this is JMAP, which is trying to do the perfect solution to email, which we have never had before. And that's probably all I need to say about that. As long as it isn't the final solution, says Alexei. So you are looking, or you should be, at the note well, which is up on the screen. I have to say it because Murray likes it when I say it. Note the note well. And let's move on from that. You've seen this many times by now. Here's the agenda. We don't need to read the agenda out loud, but have a look at it and tell us if you think there's anything truly egregious here. The agenda has been bashed. So let's hit the process. Ron, you talk for a while.
Yeah, so there's been lots of discussion about whether to use GitHub for various things. We already have draft spec up on GitHub. GitHub issues works well, I think, for this kind of thing. Certainly having the Git history and being able to see the changes over time is very useful. And we would definitely prefer to use GitHub for managing issues. I will be copying things from GitHub issues to the mailing list if there's any substantive discussion on issues that hasn't been covered in the mailing list, and likewise summarizing anything from the mailing list back to the GitHub issues if there's a long discussion on the mailing list that hasn't been covered in the issues, so we have that full history there.
And actually, I'd take it a slight step further, that if substantive discussion starts to happen on the GitHub issues, we will redirect it here and ask them to take the discussion to the mailing list. So Ron may be copying an initial message or two, and then we expect the discussion to actually move to our mailing list.
Yeah, and then the commit message will just have here's a summary of the discussions, titles of whatever threads when it closes, when that issue is closed.
Are there any comments or discussion on that mode of operating? Hearing none.
Great. That was quicker than I expected. All right. The next interesting issue is who's going to edit these specs. We have Neil Jenkins, who's the initial draft author. And we have at the moment two different things, a core data model for JMAP and then JMAP as expressed for handling email specifically. So there are two documents currently to edit, plus some additional documents that we're chartered to produce over the full lifetime of this group. So we will probably want additional editors.
Alexei, I believe you said you were considering co-editing something. The mapping to IMAP, okay, which will come later.
Yeah. And Dave, was that a hands up to help? Thank you.
And the other Neil J has volunteered.
We have two Neil J's in the room, just to be confusing. So that's Neil Javeri from Apple.
Okay, so the chairs will discuss this afterwards and report back on the mailing list what we would like to do. And the general thing is I would like to have two editors for each document. So if there isn't a bottleneck if one editor goes silent or gets busy or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess the other thing to talk about is the scope of the edits to the current draft specs that have been built over a little bit of time outside the IETF. These initial documents have been tested a little bit. The protocol was built based on experiments from Fastmail's protocol. It's been running for about 5 years for all of our customers. We're quite happy to publish that protocol so you can see how much worse it is than what JMAP has become already, but also see the history of JMAP as it's come to this point. That doesn't mean that what's there is not totally up for discussion and for changes, just that we'd like to at least test things before they go out, and this has had some testing already and a few different implementations. Any discussion on that?
Is it clear what the scope is? What is in play and what is possibly too much?
Someone asked the previous, respond to the previous question rather than the one you asked. This is Dave Crocker. We had that in the queue.
Hey.
Having you publish whatever the previous protocol draft, that's fine. Personally, I'd be particularly interested in seeing a posting, I don't think it needs to be a document, of a discussion that describes the kinds of changes and why anyone thinks they're a good idea. Getting people to think conceptually about this will probably be aided by an experiences discussion.
Excellent. Neil? Yeah.
Neil Jenkins. So just to clarify, a document of why the experiences of the current thing, or how it differs from what we started, and please clarify that, please.
Sorry, almost anything will be helpful, and so what actually gets produced will be whatever you end up landing on as a way to express. What I'm thinking of is something that is a think piece, so let's not call it a document, call it a posting. A think piece that talks about the kinds of changes from the one you've been running for 5 years to the current draft, and why those kinds of changes seem like a good idea. Because you've got 5 years of experience and it led to where things are now. And something that captures or regurgitates that could be helpful to everyone else to understand the learning experience that you went through.
And I suggest we just put that in the GitHub repository as something that sits there. Certainly, we're not going to publish that as an internet draft, but just something people can look at.
Joe Hildebrand, one of the things that we just talked about in the CBOR working group is that GitHub allows you to do wiki pages pretty easily, and that might be a good fit for this.
Yes. Alrighty.
All right. So the next thing I've got here is why JMAP? Alexi.
Just because I asked the same question in CBOR working group, did you decide on opening issues, closing issues? Who's going to do that? It wasn't on your slide.
Yes, our sense from when we discussed it at lunch the other day at a lovely place called the Purple Pig, which we recommend, is, and we especially recommend it to the remote people, is that we would prefer to have whoever raises the issue open it. So we will allow everybody to open issues, and the chairs and document shepherds, if we can get that fine with the granularity, will be the ones to close them. So once an issue is open, we decide when it's ready to be closed. And
yeah. All right, I have some other slides under the why JMAP section, because they've asked me, do we have anything to show why IMAP isn't working right now? So I'm just going to switch to them now and flick through them. These have been uploaded to the documents for this meeting as well. Some nice tweets. This is an app called Polymail that's quite popular. And down the bottom, any plan to add iCloud mail support? Absolutely, looking to bring IMAP support in the next update. This is in December 2015. Awesome, that's what we want too. And then the following thread from that right down to August 2016. Any update? You said next release, and now it's almost 2017. It's finally here. Beta support of IMAP well over a year after they were supporting Gmail via IMAP with specific protocol extensions, but not supporting generic IMAP. And then the follow-up threads are, but a whole heap of stuff doesn't work that I expect. Accompli, which is now Outlook, started with Gmail and Exchange only, and they added generic IMAP quite a while after someone saying, what, no IMAP support yet? Again, it was Gmail via IMAP. Mailbox, which no longer exists, was bought by Dropbox, and you can see from Wikipedia, because there's nowhere else to find information about it now, massively popular when it first came out, second most downloaded free app in the App Store when it came out, and was limited to Gmail and iCloud accounts only, didn't have generic IMAP support. They never really got generic IMAP support working. They supported Yahoo Mail for 3 days via IMAP and then dropped it because it wasn't working reliably. And when we spoke to their team, they said that the biggest problem was that they had to proxy to do what they wanted to do because they couldn't run IMAP directly from their client and be able to get push updates on everything. And their proxy servers were the issue. It was that they didn't have a protocol that they could speak from a phone to a server and reliably get their data. And things like Inbox app, Nihilus, have tried to solve this problem by building an API, and they run servers that proxy to IMAP, collect all the data, and then you can get push notifications about what's changed. So that's the environment that we were coming in from looking at this.
I'll add to that one thing that has become increasingly problematic with IMAP in recent years is the fact that it requires a persistent connection. And we have tried to address that with some extensions, such as the Fast Reconnect and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is we can't push updates without having an open socket. And extensions and extensions and extensions, or we can go to something like this that solves other problems as well. There should be a blue sheet floating around. If you didn't already sign it, please find it and do so. Onward.
Yeah. So this is just some things taken from our charter, and you can have a look at the charter online if you want to read the whole thing. Specify a single efficient protocol for email clients to communicate with one server endpoint. So all the things that the email client needs to do go through a single endpoint. We don't have the separation of send and receive with potential firewall issues or authentication issues showing up. You either have a fully working system or you have nothing. So you're not partly connected and then wondering why some things don't work. Addressing the mobile, poorly connected and constrained environment considerations where you don't have the ability to hold a connection open long term. Maintaining compatibility with the IMAP data models as much as possible. We need to be able to upgrade from where we are now. Defining a completely brand new protocol. Yes? Okay. Defining a completely brand new protocol that has no consideration for what's out there now is not email. And out of scope is the server-to-server communications, so replacing SMTP, MX communications, totally out of scope for this, and new end-to-end encryption right through everything is not in scope for this project. It's an interesting area, but we can solve this without solving that at the same time and getting bogged down.
Keith Moore, may I suggest that this protocol should not preclude end-to-end encryption of email?
Absolutely.
It is not the intent that it do that.
Okay.
The main thing on this server-to-server communication part is that the message submission will be done this way, but message relay won't.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And for
I
the
just don't
end-to-end
want this to be
encryption,
used.
it's just that we're not going to work on that here, at least not initially, but we certainly want to leave things open for that to be a part of this.
Okay. I just don't want that to be used as a hammer to say we're going to preclude, because there's certainly choices you could make that would preclude end-to-end encryption.
Then I would go the other way then and to say choices that are known to preclude end-to-end encryption will be looked at very closely about whether they really need to be there.
That's a start.
Thank you.
Dave Crocker, and what I'm going to say, I'm not looking for answers now. I'm raising concern and a suggestion. Back one slide, please.
Yep.
So the third bullet, I was looking at the drafts. I see references to data model, and I'm not quite sure I know what it means in those documents. And I'm not sure I know what it means in that bullet. And so I'd encourage there being some discussion of what the IMAP data model means and what requirements that's imposing on this work and what flexibilities are allowed and not allowed. And that there be enough discussion and text produced as a result of that, that it ends up guiding and constraining the steps forward.
Yep. Neil?
Just make a quick point on that.
Please say
Neil
your name.
Jenkins. The main thing we're saying here is that the JMAP protocol, you need to be able to implement that and IMAP in the same server and have people be able to access their email through both simultaneously, as they may have some clients that do IMAP and some that only do JMAP, and have that be consistent, like have that not have, or a message appears here but it doesn't appear in this one, or it's deleted in this, it's not deleted there, it's unread. So you need to be able, they need to be close enough that you can have both views of mail. That's the main constraint we're looking at here, so there is an upgrade.
So this is Dave. I was serious. I didn't actually want the detail now. I just wanted to because what you said all sounds like useful stuff, but we need actually quite a bit more for what I was looking for. But really not that.
I think just Alex, just a quick follow-up to what Dave says is, I think, let me try to rephrase it. I wish we had a document that describes IMAP model. Everybody sort of knows what they think IMAP model is, but we don't really have a document. So if we can do a little...
It's called RFC 3501, right?
Well, there is then disconnected model and offline model,
I know.
which sort of complements this, but it's probably not quite enough.
Okay, before we go to the next slide, I'd like to ask everyone, well, first we'll say that Neil just this week posted working group versions of the initial drafts. Previously, they had been draft Jenkins 00s. So there haven't been a lot of versions on this yet, and I believe the only change to the working group version is the name. A few changes that have accumulated. But so the question is, who has read one of these versions of both drafts? No. Okay, so Pete, which one? You dropped your hand quickly. Which one did you read? No. Have you read both drafts? Okay. So everyone who's all the cool people here in the front row have pretty much read some version of both drafts. Thank you.
All right. The next slide is about the main goals for JMAP around efficient use of network, ease of implementation, and the data model compatibility, which is, I guess, the question that Neil just answered before. Efficient use of network is particularly important for mobile, and also in our case, as developers in Australia working on servers in New York, we're far enough away from our servers that for us, the ability to case stuff locally and to get minimum number of round trips is very important so that we can actually use our mail interface.
In other words, your data has to hop a flight to Singapore and then change to...
Yeah, all of that, a 24-hour round trip. It takes a while. But the other thing there is control over batch sizes. One problem with IMAP is that you can be sitting there idling on a mailbox with 1 million messages in it, and some other session comes along and deletes those 1 million messages. If you're not using queue resync, which a lot of servers don't support, rather than getting vanished 1 to 1 million, you get 1 million rows that say expunge 1, expunge, or 1 expunge, 1 expunge, 1 expunge. And the only thing you can do about it is drop the connection and then reconnect and find your state. There's no way you can tell the server, stop telling me about this, I don't care. One design goal for JMAP is to always be able to know the order of magnitude, certainly, of the data you're getting. Say, I only want 100 changes, and if there's more than that, tell me and I'll do something else. And of course, out-of-band push, which we'll get to in a second, is really quite important in today's environment where a lot of mobile devices already have a way to be told that something's changed without needing to keep a TCP connection open and keep the radio running, and being able to use that rather than having to keep a connection to get told about changes is really valuable. And there've been a bunch of proprietary or semi-proprietary workarounds for that, but having a standard way to do it would be very nice. Ease of implementation is another huge thing. If you have a grand idea for what you want to do for an email client, you not only have to implement everything else that people expect in an email client before you can add your cool new feature, you also need to either implement or find libraries that implement all the underlying data model for IMAP, for SMTP, and presumably some DAV support as well if you want address books. Or you need to try a little bit, give up, and close it because you can't make it work, which we've seen happen quite a lot. So we want something that supports the kind of things that software developers today expect, that supports the libraries that are already available on platforms so that you don't have to implement a custom parser for another custom protocol. That's all I've got on this slide. Does that seem like a reasonable set of base assumptions to work from?
Keith Morgan. The thing that had cropped up to my mind before this slide came up was that it's also highly desirable for the submission part of this to be compatible with SMTP extensions. You shouldn't have to redefine versions of existing SMTP extensions, and you shouldn't have to, for new extensions, you shouldn't have to define separately a JMAP and an SMTP version. And that means syntax compatible, right? Because if you even change the syntax slightly, like, oh, maybe you should pass the whole string that would go along with the mail from or receive to or whatever command, rather than parse it across, because if you're not careful and you try to translate that into JSON, you'll break things. So you have to be careful.
So there are two parts to this, one of which is absolutely we want to avoid having to define things both for SMTP and for JMAP. The other of which is we don't need to support the bits of SMTP that are server to server. Submission is the only thing we're replacing here, the communication from client to server.
There's still extensions.
Yeah.
But there are lots of extensions that are specified by the mail client and are supposed to propagate server to server through SMTP, and that's really where my concern is.
Yes, let me shortcut this part a little bit for now and say that the charter makes it clear that as we discuss that, we need to go back to the IMAP mailing list and look at all the discussion that happened when this sort of thing was proposed to be added to IMAP. And all this stuff is covered in that discussion. So we have some reading to do as we all go back and refresh our memories of that lovely discussion. But yes, we will definitely be discussing this stuff on the list when the time comes.
Yeah. The alternative concern that I have here is that we don't want to make the 99% case really difficult for people to do to support a 1% use case, because SMTP will still be there for clients that need to use it.
Yeah, now I'm starting to think that we might have this discussion sooner rather than later, but not here and now yet. But yes, this is a morass.
Yeah.
And I think you will find that not everyone agrees with your analysis.
Yep. So according to our agenda, we are supposed to have spent around about 40 minutes getting to here. We've spent about 20, so we're well ahead of time. This is the specific... Yeah. So these were specific issues that we identified ahead of time as likely areas that the current draft specs don't really cover particularly well, or have additional work that we know needs to be done. Versioning extensions is a whole interesting area, so there's a slide on that. There will need to be support for vendor-specific extensions. Every protocol winds up with vendor-specific extensions, and particularly people may want to add additional things. For FastMail, we already have specific things we add on top of JMAP in our own thing. Neil, do you want to? That was a such as.
So one example is we have a special marker for messages that we know were sent by FastMail staff, so we can display those separately to help the user identify them. That is some things like that are hard to make generic. It might be possible, but a lot of those, even if you did make them generic in the future, you would start as specific, vendor-specific things until you are sure that this is a good idea and broadly applicable, and then try and add those in elsewhere.
This is Pete Resnick. The reason for the cringe is I feel us going down an X- path. And for so long as what you mean by vendor-specific extras is that there's a quick and easy way to add extensions that may or may not in the future be used by everybody else, and may or may not be, you know, formalized eventually because we all think that's a great idea, that's fine. What we don't want to have is the vendor-specific extensions and then the real extensions. That would be a bad pattern to repeat.
Neil Jenkins. So that's exactly the kind of discussion that we're meant to be having now. That's the kind of comment I want. My current thinking is that you would need to opt in some way. It wouldn't be X-. You would, like, at the protocol level, you'd say, I want to use this extension, and then everything would be in there. But the exact mechanism, and again, can you provide versions? Can the server say, I support version 1 of this extension, version 2? Is that a thing, or are they just different extensions? Those are the kind of things I think we should look at past experience and what works well in this situation.
Dave Crocker, so is it fair to recast that term vendor-specific to spontaneously generated or locally generated?
Not yet standardized.
Not yet standardized. Actually, I like that a lot because it by implication states a vector but doesn't require following it.
Yep.
This is reminding me of the provisional versus, with some.
Neil Jenkins. I think what's more interesting is kind of the semantics of how this works. Like, do you get exposed to any extensions the server has without explicitly asking for them? Or does the server only give what's in the base spec unless you explicitly ask for something more? And then do you have different versions for JMAP core, or just JMAP plus extensions, and maybe in the future we say this set of extensions is the new core version 2018, and that's how we upgrade JMAP in the future.
Joe Hildebrand. We did that in XMPP, and it was pretty successful. So about once a year, we'd get together and write down, here's the consensus amongst the current implementations of what's being used frequently. And we do that both server side and client side. So there's a series of, what's that? It had a JEP number. Yeah, so, but you can go, I'll send some links to that to the chat room, please.
Thanks.
So I'll do some version of my usual rant about version numbers. SMTP doesn't have version numbers. It has extensions. And my view from this is, if the protocol is a new protocol, it's a new protocol. Versions don't help you. I mean, all you've done is create another layer of multiplexing. If you are adding extensions, then there's a kind of upward compatibility, and the declaration of the extension is what you need anyhow. You don't need a version.
Yeah, so one of the difficulties with that I've mentioned on the slide there is that you can say I'm an IMAP4 server and you can advertise in all your glossy brochures, we support IMAP4. And what you've got is IMAP4 Rev 1 with maybe 1 or 2 UID plus or something, but you don't support Constore, you don't support any of the modern stuff that makes IMAP4 not awful.
So there's a kind of marketing benefit in being able to talk about a package of extensions that you do.
But it's more than a marketing benefit, and there is some value in making a profile of some sort, and whether you want to call that a version or a profile or whatever. Everyone knows that a POP server that doesn't support TOP and APOP and whatever is not a functioning POP server. IMAP has so many extensions. Lemonade tried to profile that and say, here's a bunch of extensions that you really need to support. Once we start developing a lot of extensions, it is useful to say these are the popular ones that really need to be supported to be modern. And cutting that and saying that's a new version or whatever you want to call it is useful. So it isn't just marketing.
So Dave again. Yes, everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. It's I think, kind of straightforward. And it's less of a technical point and more of an operational and marketing point. And I don't mean anything negative by saying those, but they're not actually protocol points.
Yes.
Yeah, as a client author, the flip side of that is that if you can't rely on certain important extensions being present, you either write 2 code paths, both of which are buggy, or you stick with just 1 buggy code path, which is the lowest common denominator, and you don't bother trying to implement the other one because there's no point.
So this is Joe Hildebrand, in order to step aside from the potential negative connotation from marketing, which is much more about outbound messaging from your company's products, instead we used to think about this as inbound in terms of how to help product managers prioritize features versus competition. And one of the ways that we did that was saying core server, core client versus advanced client, advanced server, as just a way of saying, hey, here's some stuff that really everybody has to do, and that's in core. And then here's what all the cool kids are doing.
Yeah.
It was just a way to focus that discussion amongst the multiple interoperable implementations.
Neil Jenkins. One of the most successful attempts I think I've seen in the last 10 years of getting multiple independent implementations of a standard to really up their game to the next level has been the acid test with CSS. And by defining, here's a test that uses a load of new properties that have been standardized. Browser and users could point their browser at it and go, oh, I get a score 79. That spurred competition between the browser vendors to get to 100 first, and it also provides a way of one user to brag to another user, oh, mine's better than yours, it's got a higher number. It's that kind of thing, being able to define profiles, say, hey, here's a test that does this profile, and we'll give you a score that actually gets companies to move, to upgrade, and also allows client developers to say, I require this, and you can even test this, and you can tell your vendor that they're not good enough because they don't support this. And that way, yes, it's all CSS, but my browser supports CSS2 or CSS3, and I know because this acid test told me. And as a user, I can see a number, and I don't have to know what it means, but I can understand the higher is better, and I can pressure my vendor to upgrade as well and not be stuck in the past.
So this is Barry. I think that over time we can have the discussion of whether these, let's say, groups of extensions become a new version or are grouped in some other way, perhaps a meta extension that includes them all or something like that. I think it is clear that at some point we might find some feature that needs to be changed in an incompatible way, which would require some kind of versioning. That certainly happened between IMAP2 and IMAP4, for instance. And something like that could happen in JMAP over time. We hope it won't, because we hope we've learned enough at this point, but you never know.
Another dimension to this whole discussion is, at the moment we have core and we have mail. Core is a data model that can be used for many other things. At Fastmail, we have calendars, contacts, and just recently file storage as well, running over similar protocols. Calendars and contacts are still on the old protocol. Files is on the JMAP model because that's very new. There will be additional things that people want to expose via this same connection and same protocol, like, for example, if they have a CRM that they want to link to their emails and display more details than just a basic contact next to an email that's been received. This seems to be a very popular feature that's coming in a lot of clients at the moment, either plugins or directly, the ability to see more information about the person you're talking to. That would be the kind of thing that someone would want to extend as a new object within their JMAP connection rather than as something that they're sending over this same already standardized bits. So that's another dimension that I imagine extensions will happen in.
How many of you, raise your hands, might be interested in later on working on calendar and contact versions of a protocol like this? We have quite a few hands raised. So yeah, we can see follow-on work for that if this succeeds.
Actually, before we move on, do we think we're at a point where we should take this discussion to the mailing list now? Is there anything else we should do in this room about extensions and versioning specifically? That here it comes.
Well, yeah, it depends how much time you want to spend on this and how detailed you want to get. But I think there are sort of 2 or 3 related issues here. You know, what's the base spec, how you incorporate new extensions, you know, vendors, you know, experimental or not yet standardized versus standardized, as well as how you enable them from the client. That's another side of it. So, yeah, maybe we should raise like 3 issues and then start discussing them on the mailing list.
Yeah, one important thing, as someone who's on the far side of the world from the server, I don't want to add too many round trips to version negotiation.
Pete Resnick, a question. I maybe missed it in the discussion, but is the idea here that what you had labeled as vendor-specific extras, that there would be a bunch of potential extensions and at some point you package them into a version or a package or whatever the heck we want to call it. And then they would, the ones that were in the package would no longer be non-standardized. They would be standardized because now they're in the package. And the ones that are fluff go away or yeah.
I'm very much hoping that we first standardize the bits and then we'll decide to package, not the other way around.
Yeah, I think that's what he said.
No, he said, you know, you package vendor-specific one with base spec and...
That's what I said.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what he said. No. No.
Okay, that looks like something to talk about on the mailing list. All right, we'll just.
At some point, we need to just start looking at text in the document and commenting on it. So let's move on here.
All right. Next is the push mechanism. There is an RFC 8030 for web push, which looks like the right thing for this protocol. Neil, did you?
Neil Jenkins. So yes, I think there are 2 interesting things to talk about here. First, there's the mechanism by which pushes are delivered from the server to the client, and there is what do you push and when. So the current plan is there are 2 different mechanisms you can use to push from the client to the server. One is event source or server sent. Sorry, from the server to the client. Sorry, I said something wrong. One is event source, or also known as server sent events. That requires a persistent connection, but does not require any other intermediate servers or anything. It's very simple. If you have a desktop client or browser, it's really easy to set up, and it's a standard, and it doesn't. Okay, well, we'll get to that. And the other one's IETF98-JMAP-20170330, which is the more complicated push mechanism, but can integrate with APNS or GCM or whatever to deliver push over out-of-band mechanisms to the client. Okay, let's start with discussing that. I'll stop there.
All right. So Martin Thompson, I confess I'm a tourist in here, but when people start citing RFCs, I wrote, it gets interesting. 8030 is going to work if you're in a web browser, and it's probably not going to work very well outside of that. You can probably take some of the design principles and use those. Now, those design principles are the ones that lead to the other comment, which is that event source and long-running TCP listeners and whatnot are terrible ideas. I would suggest either using the same mechanisms that 8030 uses, or using something as much as I hate to suggest it, like WebSockets. If you want a bidirectional channel for sending messages with no real semantics attached to them, then that's what you can do, and you build your own semantics. That is essentially what you have in the protocol right now, based on what I'm reading online. So maybe you're comfortable with that.
This was a why is event source a terrible idea?
Yeah, so event source is basically being abandoned by the W3C because it has several other far more superior technologies. One of the reasons that event source doesn't necessarily work is that you find that there are intermediaries that you didn't expect in the path, and those intermediaries do interesting things to the messages that you receive, such that you won't receive them when you expect to receive them. So, example, virus scanner, it needs to see the entire body of an HTTP response before it gives you that message. What's event source? It's a body that never ends. So what does the virus scanner do? You never get a response, right? It never even starts.
Yeah, Pat McManus, the store and forward semantics part I was talking about is definitely an issue with event source. Also, resource quotas are a problem with event source commonly. Ties up a connection persistently forever, and often where that gets accounted for is unaware that that's a forever connection, and you exhaust that pool. Like you run 6 tabs with JMAP and you use up all your connections, you try to run the 7th, it just doesn't work, right? That's a common problem with event source.
Yeah, I'll just comment a little bit on Neil Jenkins on those two, because we have experience running event source. That second point is absolutely true, and we have code that multiplexes different tabs to use a single event source and passes the information between the tabs to avoid that issue, which does suck. I completely agree. Although it's nice also not to have 6 connections to the server getting the same data. So in some ways, it's still a nice thing. The other issue with the antivirus stuff, we haven't run into too much in practice, but I totally agree that that thing can happen. And if there's a better solution that doesn't have other significant downsides, then we should totally be using that instead.
Yeah, so one of the things you might find is that in certain environments, people won't be using your service because it doesn't work, and you won't know about it. And it's really hard to measure these things. We encounter this problem with Firefox all the time, is we have whole classes of issues that we don't hear about until our long-term support release goes out, and it gets put into places where we don't have any telemetry, we don't, and all of a sudden we got this like huge flood of complaints. You broke this. No. We broke that 8 months ago, but sure. The question was, would you recommend WebSockets? And I would never do that.
What would you recommend?
My name is, essentially, HTTP2 has a server push mechanism that is pretty good for these things. And that's essentially what 8030 does, is it just uses HTTP server push to push interesting information at clients. And that may be what you're looking for. Essentially, maybe one way of thinking about this is here's some requests you might want to make.
Actually, this brings an interesting point. RFC 8030 is HTTP 2.0, right? Well, this JMAP can run over 1.1, so I think that might be a separate issue we need to discuss, which version of HTTP we require.
Did 8030 require HTTP 2? I thought, okay,
Yes.
but does it have a profile that would work with 1.1? Okay. The answer was there are parts you can use with 1.1, but not the parts we care about here.
So for a brand new protocol, why is 1.1 a requirement?
It's a brand.
I'm not sure that was a rhetorical question.
No.
So let's,
So if you could completely say we have to only use the latest new stuff. It's a matter of, I guess, how much is compatible with 2.0 now in terms of client libraries.
2/3 of my HTTPS traffic is HTTP2. It's not a new cutting edge thing.
Cool. I guess actually to answer that, the other thing is that while JMAP is specified as JSON over HTTP, the data model doesn't require that. You could quite easily move it to being purely over WebSockets or over meld, if you ever get that working.
So Dave Crocker, yeah, I was listening to this exchange and came to the point of thinking that there needs to be some discussion and clarity about the, I'll use the word transport, the over, and what range of choices the group wants to require. And this is going to turn out to be probably have tension between the wonderful future, which is the present, and the unfortunate past, and the unknown future, which is all the other things we think we'd like to do. And keeping it practical will be a challenge, but keeping it flexible will be too.
right, this is Barry. I'll point out that we may want to do it over quick at some point. So having some flexibility there, before Martin talks, I'll just say that the core working group has dealt with this by having their initial spec be CoAP over UDP, but then providing alternative transport options that say how to do it over TCP and how to do it over HTTP and so on.
So Martin Thompson, Quick has promised that they will provide all of the same features that HTTP2 provides. And so you can, well, if Quick is successful and you want to use it, it will be sufficient for that purpose.
Right. However, I'm not so naive as to think there will be no changes required in order to do that. And so we might need
There should be no changes to applications using HTTP. That is the promise.
Okay.
There may be some performance differences,
Yeah.
but in terms of semantics and all of those sorts of things, no problem there. I didn't get up to say that. I got up to say the other thing, Martin Thompson. When we build application protocols that are ignorant of the thing that they're running on, they're often grossly suboptimal, and they exhibit some very interesting properties in terms of taking on work that they don't need to. They duplicate, replicate things. So I see message identifiers in protocols, and just so happens that HTTP has a way of correlating requests with responses and things like that. So I'd encourage people to have a good hard look at that and think about what they're doing when they do these things. I also note that you have so many things that ultimately end up in post requests, which this makes me, from an HTTP perspective, quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, Brian Gondwan, I just want to talk to the different protocols thing. I have joked about sending JMAP over emails. I don't think that's a realistic transport, but possibly something like Signal is a realistic transport, where you have something that sends messages backwards and forwards with a remote service that already has a completely different encryption layer, a completely different usage pattern than an HTTPS connection, and is entirely disconnected. You can send a message and then get a response back without holding a connection even for that round trip. That is something that I can see JMAP being transported over.
I did say beep, and I wasn't totally joking. Keith.
Keith Moore. So I'm trying to think of an occasion where I've seen a higher layer protocol layered over multiple lower layer protocols that doesn't produce essentially in different protocols. Because in addition to the concerns the previous speaker raised, there's almost inevitably over time a semantic drift between the way that this protocol is used over layer A and this same protocol is used over layer B, and so on and so forth. And so what you get is you need a different implementation for each of those stacks. And I would say, please don't go there. And the other thing I would say is, if you're going to bring in all the HTTP2 baggage in with this new protocol, I'm not sure you're creating something better than the situation with IMAP. You're just moving the problem. So, if you're going to the trouble of producing a new protocol, maybe don't bring that particular camel into the tent.
Keith, before you go away, what baggage are you referring to with respect to HTTP2?
There's not enough time here to talk about it.
Okay. Dave.
So I'm pretty sure IP over each of the many media it runs over is the same protocol. So this can be done. But if we want to target JMAP over a variety of transports, we need to make it work over avian carrier. But after all, you said you didn't want it to be a chatty protocol. This would test that.
That certainly would.
Keith, regarding Dave's point, I don't recall a situation in which IP has not been run with multiple lower layers in series. In other words, at all times the internet has evolved, except maybe from the very earliest flag day when it was just the ARPANET, but very soon after that it was gateway over Ethernet and some things like that. So it was intentionally designed to do that, but also on a hop by hop basis, which I don't think is what we're talking about here.
I could see JMAP being store and forward in a kind of extreme case. No. Not long-term store, but being examined by proxies and possibly rewritten by proxies.
So I think Keith actually made a good point in response to that, which was that if you develop a protocol and expect it to do all of these things, do it over HTTP here and you do it over, I don't know, some instant messaging network over here. It's a different protocol at that point. And the semantics do bleed.
Putting his foot down just as I'm taking
Neil. Yeah, I think those were being a bit facetious and taking it too far. I think there's certainly going to be an argument for maybe using Quick or even WebSockets or something like that. I don't think it's intended to go over something so different, semantically different to HTTPS, which is the original thing. The other thing I would say is I think you could require HTTP2 for the push bit whilst not requiring it for anything else, which would still let you get a perfectly functional client just without push.
Joe Hildebrand, I made a face at that because I don't think that an email client without push is functional. So the fact that we had set that as the bar many years ago, I think it's time to change that. But that's something we can disagree on. My opinion is that binding this to HTTP2 with the intent that it would also work for Quick without modification other than to your HTTP library, having it get taught Quick underneath, would be a way for us to get something done much more quickly that worked and interoperated pretty well. If we want to specify other protocol bindings, it is possible there are tricks that you can do to make that easier when it comes to that. And one of those, for example, is to take the HTTP wrapper and put it inside the other the other thing, which is horrible. I'm not saying that that's a good idea from a protocol design perspective. I'm just using that as a existence proof that you could do such a thing. We're not necessarily painting ourselves into a corner that we can't get out of. If, for example, we decide to use message IDs from HTTP, you could decide that in the binding to WebSockets, if you were to do such a thing, that it would hoist out the message ID that you would make available. So I would suggest that as a first pass, just do the HTTP2 thing and take the win.
Okay.
Further discussion of pushing will go to the list. Neil, maybe it won't.
I think further discussion of that should probably go to the list, but I will, as I was saying at the beginning, there's two things to discuss. I think we've discussed the mechanism. The other part to discuss is kind of what to push and when. So at the moment, what's specified in the draft is that each type, like a message is a type, a thread is a type, a mailbox is a type, has a state string, and that basically changes whenever something about that collection of objects changes. And so simply when something changes to that collection, you get pushed the new state string to the type, and the client can then efficiently ask the server for what's changed and deal with that like that. So it's a very small amount of data that actually goes up the push channel, and it doesn't include any real identifying or sensitive data. That may still be too frequent, however, if you had like a mobile device and you only want to know when a new mail's arrived rather than someone's just marked something red or stuff like that. So I think there might be an interesting discussion over how much granularity the client's allowed to request, or whether what's there is fine, and any comments on that kind of thing.
This is Barry. My comment on it is that typically the way this has worked with other protocols is the client says what it wants pushed to it, and the server pushes that. Seems to be an easy thing to implement with this protocol.
Yeah, so that was Neil
granular-
comment. What granularity would the protocol support specifying is the question.
Well, Martin Thompson, that's a choice you can make.
And I would say that anything that can be pushed can be asked to be pushed or not.
So the
Any
interesting
class of things.
interesting question here is that, do you want to be pushed about changes to every message, or do you only want to be pushed changes that match, say, a search or a filter on messages, in which case we need to be able to specify via the protocol, here is a filter to apply to this data type before you decide whether to push or not.
This is Pete Resnick. The thing you didn't take into account, Barry, was it's not the granularity across, it's the granularity down. You can
Yes.
go infinitely smaller and smaller. And so you have to decide where the line, the cut line is.
IMAP, for instance, you get notified of changes to the selected mailbox, and here we have more flexibilities.
Yeah, so an interesting thing, do you want to only be notified if you get a message from your boss and have a filter that says from boss@corp.com?
Just, blast from the past, we did work on IMAP notify extension, which goes into some of it, but also doesn't give enough details in some cases. So you can select a list of mailboxes you want to be notified on and what type of changes you want. So again, I'm not saying we'll use this particular bit, but something we should look at.
Yeah, that discussion definitely needs to be on the list. So, okay.
Are we finished with push? Let's move on to the next exciting thing, security considerations. I just throw some acronyms at this slide. Yes, all the things, both authentication and how you establish a JMAP session token, or whatever we want to call the thing that allows you to identify yourself to the server. And then lots of considerations around very much protocol specifics like TLS, HSTS, whether we have access controls within an account that you can only see certain messages, and what that means if you have labels where a message can be in more than one mailbox. If you can only see some of those mailboxes, what do you see about them? What do you see about stuff that's been removed? Yeah.
And clearly the list of security considerations is not limited to what's on this slide. I have a question that I'll ask after Dave talks.
So Dave Crocker, so this actually triggered my realizing that the documents I've seen and the discussion so far, there was a reference to IMAP's different modes of use, and there's been nothing like that here. The detached asynchronous mode for using IMAP versus fully dependent on the server and so on, and that the choices of these usage scenarios seem to me meaningful. And I was, as this was being discussed just now, I was thinking of collaborative access to a shared folder as opposed to my private folder. The differences are meaningful. The access control list is just an example of that, that's what triggered it. But I'm suspecting that there's a discussion of scenarios, usage scenarios, that we haven't had that should be had and documented and then rigorously adhered to. Unfortunately, the other thing this triggers in my mind is, to the extent that there is a belief that the mail use of the underlying protocol is one example of a range. When that kind of a model is developed and you only do it initially for one use, on the average, the second use doesn't work right.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, the only way to fix that is to do more than one at the same time, and we're not chartered to do that.
Neil Jenkins. I agree that that is often the case, and while we're not chartered to do that, we have got experience using it for at least four other different data type collections. I think we can make sure that we keep those up to date with the latest standard too, and if anything does crop up, we can raise that as a tangential issue without having to need a full charter to work on those.
Calendars, contacts, notes, files.
And a separate product as well.
Yes.
So yes, we're using the JMAP core with various other things that aren't just mail. And so I think even if that's not in the charter, we will find if there's big issues that come up from that as we keep stuff up to date with the latest draft, which we will try and do as much as possible. The other thing I wanted to mention was, yes, the disconnected versus always online scenario. I actually think the disconnected scenario is kind of almost a trivial reduction of the online scenario. The online one is where you need to be able to access kind of random bits efficiently and get updates just those bits. Whereas offline is I have everything and then I just need to get updates to that.
No, that's a bad assumption. Offline does not mean you have everything. So dispel that thought and then rethink what offline means.
Okay, so well, I was treating it as partial versus full, fine, but the JMAP data model is particularly much better suited than IMAP for having a partial data set and then getting changes to that later and keeping that in sync, which I think is the hard case, and most other things reduce from that. Therefore,
I can believe that, but I also think you are not thinking of it deep enough. But I believe you are correct that it will be easier to do this with JMAP than with IMAP.
Dave Crocker, I have a feeling that what you have is a model that does disconnected really well, and so that the interactive is trivial.
Yeah.
The question that I wanted to ask, the note on this slide that we say minimum TLS levels and make a reference to HSTS, does anyone think that we should allow this to be run over a non-encrypted pipe? I see heads shaking, I see no heads nodding. This is good news here, but this is something we should nail down on the mailing list and make sure we have consensus on early on.
I would actually say there's a trivial case where you are talking even in process within stuff that's on a single machine that you probably don't want to encrypted pipe yourself. If your pipe is, I've got a process that's running and then a proxy process that adds some additional stuff on top of it.
I think if you are running over HTTP,
Yeah. Then
run it encrypted.
it's secure only.
Right.
Yeah.
It's and read that to Quick and so on, but you know, Quick already comes with it.
Dave Crocker, just as the word security has no technical substance to it, TLS has enough variety to it that we often think it means a lot, but we don't. And so, for example, this is the easiest example, is opportunistic versus not opportunistic, ...
That's why deciding how to handle TLS is on the list.
So HTTP really doesn't have this notion of opportunistic in the same way that mail does. Just make people get a cert. It's not really all that expensive.
It's
Authenticate.
very cheap with Let's Encrypt, sure.
Yeah, for a server, certainly. Whether you require clients to have certificates is a whole different discussion.
Keith Moore, you know, I may be out of the loop a bit, but has anyone ever solved the problem of producing a cert or the equivalent of a cert for a server that's on your LAN and that you only configure with an IP address? No, it doesn't have a domain name. Does Let's Encrypt solve it? Give you a cert for your IP address?
Please keep it on the microphone.
Okay, sorry. It always struck me that it's very odd to have a cert for an RFC 1918 address. So yeah.
The other thing that helps there is DNS proof types, and even if so, you can put a text record in, and that gives you the ability to prove that you owned it, and then you can use it on a 1918 address. And I do that at home all the time. You get an internal name, but you can also do IP certs now. So I think we're operationally, I think we're in pretty safe territory just saying, let's require TLS. Yes.
Okay, next is interaction with existing standards. And there's a couple of different things here, one of which is there have been various proposals to standardize what Gmail does now with their XGM message ID, XGM thread ID, where there's an underlying ID for something that's exposed via IMAP that may change its IMAP address. It may get moved to a different folder. The folder itself might get a new UID validity for whatever reason, and then all the UIDs are no longer cacheable via a client. But there's a way that the server could say this actually is the same thing that you already have. So whether we want to standardize the things that are in JMAP to give longer lived IDs to objects and standardize those by IMAP that you can fetch a message ID for a message and know that it is the same thing when it's moved to a new folder, or know that a folder is the same folder if it's renamed on the server.
So are you talking about, should we do extensions to IMAP to match some of the nice new features that this provides?
Or should we work with IMAP extensions?
Right. I think that's out of scope for this working group, but we can
It's
certainly
out of scope,
discuss
and we're
it.
discussing forming a mail maintenance working group that will probably address this.
Yes. But it is something that it would be useful to keep a list of,
That's probably this third document about mapping to IMAP, that it can say, well, this feature maps roughly to this extension, or certain features have no equivalent at the moment or whatever.
Yes.
And the second half of that is mapping from the RFC 5322 email to a JMAP mail object where it's been parsed out into JSON, and working out exactly how that mapping looks both ways. And it's probably not 100% fidelity, certainly mapping from every single possible email to the JSON representation of them and still having a JSON representation that's usable. But JMAP does support fetching the raw bytes as well.
You don't see why that should be a problem. I think the other way around, you can certainly construct JSON objects that couldn't be turned into RFC 5322. But I'm not sure the other way around is, and not just 5322, remember mine as well. So.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about like subject can be in different languages, they can be decoded, all of this, as well as
but that can,
line unfolding and well,
that can all be encoded in JSON from.
Yeah, no, I think we probably don't want to allow for certain combinations.
There are some pretty ugly things you can do with multi-part.
Yeah, unless we want to say that we want to preserve fidelity, as in you should be able to reconstruct a message, and that, might or might not be a requirement.
What Bron just said disturbed me. That he said there are some pretty ugly things you can do with multi-part. If we have a case where there are valid MIME messages that you can't represent here, I think we have a failure. So think about that.
This is DKG. I just want to bring to the group's attention that clear MIME signed messages, whether it's PGP or S-MIME, are explicitly stated that the multi-part signed messages must not be tampered with. Anything in the signed part, including subparts. Right?
We need to be able to reconstruct them exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Octet for octet. If you care about it,
Neil Jenkins. So yes, this is a little bit unclear, perhaps. For that case, you would simply fetch the RFC 5322 message from the server, and the client can handle it itself, and you get the bytes exactly as they are on the server. The point of the JSON representation is that for basically anything that's not signed, or it doesn't have to have the raw bytes, it has a much easier to deal with representation. And it would probably still use this anyway to get headers and stuff, so it can efficiently fetch the data without having to fetch the actual message, and things like decoding different encodings in the subject line and stuff like that, the server deals with, so that the client is much simpler, just gets the subject, it's a UTF-8 string, any weird decoding of the MIME stuff is already done by the server. But you're right, Barry, that any weird arrangements of multi-part and other things that are in use, we need to work, it needs to represent, so that most clients, I would expect, don't actually even ever fetch the raw version. It would just use the JSON from the server to make it much easier for you to construct a client, and it gives it everything that it actually needs.
I'll also throw out DKIM signed messages. You clearly don't want to just keep those in one blob because they're signed, but you need to be able to reconstruct the message to verify the signature.
The server would verify.
Neil said the server will verify DKIM signature, which is probably, I tend to agree.
DKIM allows you to verify a signature later. Go ahead.
Okay, I think, yeah, let's add an issue for this, and we'll discuss in the meeting, I guess. What I wanted to add about verifying like multi-part signed, I just recently did S-MIME verification using IMAP. It's actually not possible to reconstruct the message in IMAP because, well, it's rather complicated to do this because you also need to fetch boundaries, and you need to fetch comments in boundaries, MIME prologues, MIME epilogues. There are actually no direct facilities in IMAP to do this. You need to do ranges, and you need to guess how much data you need to download. So this, if you want to do this properly, we need to think a bit more about this.
Ned has a comment on Jabber. Actually doing that, I'm not sure exactly which that is right now, but actually doing that creates a security hole. A server, knowing the client behavior, can send the original message for signature verification and something different in the parsed form. I guess he's talking about verifying a DKIM signature in the client.
This, Dave Crocker, there's a chance what I'm about to say is compatible with that, but that wasn't why I got up
Any
here.
kind of signature is what Neil, what Ned clarifies.
There is a difference between a kind of a thick versus thin client model, the extent to which the client depends upon the server can vary. And in some discussions, it's a question of trust. In any event, one of the challenges that raises is a server which has deep knowledge of all of the content versus a server which is mostly sending relatively uninterpreted chunks of things for the client to use. I think given the realities of the world with privacy and security that we are facing, we want to be able to support both modes. Yes. Not exactly clear to me what the implications are, but I think they're non-trivial.
Yeah, I agree on both modes, and that's kind of why I was pushing on this. Ned further clarifies, as SMIME is the more important case, multi-part signed. Object security in email is hard. I think Barbie said that.
John Levine, I'm wondering if
Barbie thinks everything's hard.
Yeah, I'm wondering if EAI is implicitly on this list or not.
That is a good question. So, are the Fastmail people aware of EAI, SMTP, UTF-8, and IMAP UTF-8 and all? Yes. Okay, aware of it, but not involved with it. So I think we need, as a working group, to decide whether we're going to deal with this. I prefer that we do, but I don't get to choose that. The working group does.
Yeah, it is technically straightforward, but has some semantic rattles.
Thanks for raising that, John. So we need to have an issue for discuss EAI.
Neil Jenkins again. Just with regard to the how much information the server has on these messages, the vast majority of email client usage these days, in fact, is mobile, and people have large amounts of email. And most of the things, to access that in a decent way, being able to search fully, jump to different bits of the mailbox, get previews and everything, basically requires the server to have information about the messages. And so most of the best bits of JMAP, most of the advantages you get only come if the server can actually see this, and I think that's okay for email. Mostly we've discovered that you really need completely good end-to-end encryption. You should be using something like Signal. Email, even with SMIME and stuff, is not encrypting headers and stuff. You can, of course, use it with end-to-end encrypted emails with generally the body encrypted then, and then obviously the client will just have to fall back to fetching more data and then fetching the raw RFC 5322 message and decoding that locally.
Yeah, either the server is decoding it or it's not, and if it's not, then you fall back to being a blob store and forward service.
This is DKG. So there is still interest in actually managing to secure mail. Mail is not going away. We can't tell everyone who wants secure messaging, who doesn't trust the intermediaries, to move to Signal. So please make sure that JMAP doesn't dismiss the use case of end-to-end encrypted mail as not in the 99% that we're going to optimize for. It needs to account for it. This is what Keith was saying earlier, and I think it's just like, please do not take that off the list. If it ends up being the object blob store, that's fine, but make sure that that use case is handled.
Neil Jenkins, I think I'm saying it already can fall back to being an object blob store. It's just that's kind of almost the simple case. It's not, and most of the interesting functionality is going to require, obviously, the server to be able to understand the message. But because you can fetch the raw message, yes, it can fall back to just blob store and you won't get anything useful from the past version. That's okay. I think that the charter already has, what's in scope is, yes, making sure we know how it's going to interact with things like SMIME and PGP, but we're not defining any new mechanisms. That will be a separate working group.
We're done with...
That was fun. I think we're done with this slide.
So this was Alexi's point, and a few people have raised this. JMAP draft at the moment doesn't have any specific support for keywords other than the few system flags that are already defined, things like seen or is unseen. Support for keywords and support for the per message annotations and per folder metadata that exist as IMAP extensions. Well, keywords is in the base spec. At the moment, there's no analog for that in JMAP, and looking at how that would be added would be, I think, a worthwhile discussion point on its own. How to add mutable bits to the immutable message.
Discussion now, please, on whether we think that message and folder annotations ought to be part of this. In IMAP, they were put in as extensions later on, and implementation of that is spotty. We have no discussion. Pete Rise.
Pete Resnick, and full disclosure, I did not read the documents really carefully. There is no way to put metadata or properties on a message in the current spec. I may have imagined it, but I thought.
Neil Jenkins. So the mutable bits of a message at the moment in the spec are system flags, red, flagged and things like that, and also the set of mailboxes to which it belongs. Now, in IMAP, and if that may be restricted to just one mailbox per message, but you can also have a backend that supports multiple, which is more like your labels approach, like you would have with Gmail, which then gives you arbitrary metadata kind of tagging capabilities. The keywords stuff is not in there at the moment, and that's what we're going to add, and this is what this discussion is about. That's kind of orthogonal metadata system.
Let me have Ned jump in and say, he says, I think annotations are crucial, as do I, Barry. What we're talking about is a user being able to put arbitrary annotations on a message.
Wait, before you disappear.
You might as well stay up, Neil.
Yeah. So if the mailbox to which it belongs, and we can have multiple of them, and they can have different names, is a fully extensible list that I can have 500 mailboxes to which it belongs, then I've got a fully extensible metadata thing, because I can put any old string in there.
We have a fully extensible keys. I mean, yeah.
Generic annotations they're not just tags, they can be like text and integers and strings and ways.
Right. I don't want to just say that if I want to say Pete sent this last night, I don't want Pete sent this last and night to be mailbox names. I mean, I want to be able to just have some string that I stuck on this message so I know what it's about.
That's one mailbox that extended.
I don't want it to be associated with mailboxes. I want it to be associated with my textual annotation of the message. I made a comment on my message.
Pete, this is a hack.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay, and as we traverse into the rat hole, as it opens wider, you can shove me out and say, that's that. But the eject button, we need the eject button. Have the Pac-Man come and eat me. So, and we've chatted about this, and I think I even chatted with some of the Fastmail folks who got stuck with me on Sunday. Mailboxes are a hack, right? I mean,
that's certainly what Mark said.
It's one way to implement a piece of metadata, that you stick them in a different piece of the file system, but that's completely arbitrary. What we want is arbitrary markings user provided on the message, and whether we make those arbitrary markings represent a file system or just some random piece of data like Pete sent this last night, that's an arbitrary marking on the message. And so it's only a hack if mailboxes are some sort of first order magical thing. If mailbox is just another annotation, then it's not a hack, it's just another annotation.
Let me throw it a different way, that certain metadata has specific meaning that goes beyond. So mailboxes are specific kinds of metadata that we separate out. Annotations, okay, so let me put what Ned said, and then we'll have too many N's, and we'll have Neil speak. Ned says, if you want to enable a new generation of workflows based on email, you need the ability to hang data off messages somehow. Of course, if you have a UUID, you can put it in a separate database or something, but that's not interoperable. Neil.
Neil Jenkins. So yeah, one of the things adding metadata is going to be very useful, but also we want to keep compatibility with IMAP stuff. That's also important. So I think we have 3 different things here, which is why it's useful to have mailboxes, keywords, and annotations. Mailboxes in JMAP are not so like a file system in IMAP. You can map it to that, but they can also be mapped to, as we said, multiple, so like labels, like you might find in Gmail or something. And that has a particular semantics because those kind of groupings that you would expect the client to allow users to quickly see everyone. Of course, you could search by other metadata as well, but I think like your random text, like I want to make a note on this email, that's not something you're going to see everything that has exactly this note. That's not helpful, and that's the kind of thing annotation would be useful. And finally, the keywords thing I think is mainly because it's there in IMAP, and the important thing is we have extra system flags being defined, like there's like junk, phishing, we're hoping to add a new flag and stuff as well, which will already be defined in the registry with IANA. So it's really just for system flags. I don't expect that to be used in JMAP much for user assigned flags. I think that's not happened very much in existing email clients because it's not very well adapted to that. But having that as an existing registry where we have system flags that is extensible and IMAP supports and there's been extra flags is also useful. So that's the way I would see it. You've got the mailboxes, you've got your keywords, which is mainly for system flags, but it's extensible with the IANA registry, and annotations where you can put your arbitrary comments and whatever other data you want to associate with the message.
Ted Lemon, complete non-expert on this. From my perspective, as a complete non-expert, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that annotations. So an annotation is basically another message. I mean, it doesn't have any RFC822 headers, but it's basically the same sort of object as a message.
No. The difference between an annotation and a message is that messages are immutable once they arrive in the system, and annotations are mutable. You can change an annotation at any point without it getting a new ID.
Basically, an annotation is a character string that the user has attached to the message.
The
that's private to the user.
distinction that I'm trying to make is that being able to group messages, so an annotation, it seems to me that an annotation is a big hunk of data potentially, not a small hunk of data, right? And so the general use case that I would have for something like this is actually there's a bunch of messages that are related, and I have some annotations that are related to those messages. And so the reason why I'm kind of, I feel a little vague here, but the reason why I'm kind of pushing back on this a little bit is because I think that what you really want is to be able to have an object, maybe it's mutable and it's not actually a message, but it's basically another kind of object that you can label, or that you can have an identifier for it that you can associate with one or more messages, not the text string that is associated with one message.
This feels like the kind of case where you would create a folder and have the metadata, which is an annotation on a folder, saying this folder, these details, and name and some additional things.
And then the generate case of that is one message within that one.
Yeah.
So that is one use case for it. Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say there's a folder per annotation or something, and as you say, degenerate case is this one message in the folder.
Well, I mean, so you know, if the annotation is anything more than essentially something that could be a string, a small string, then yeah. If it's just a small string, then I don't see why it makes a whole lot of difference whether it's a label or an annotation.
I think in most cases it will be a small string, but I don't think we want to limit our box to that. The idea is that each annotation is something a user has associated with this message.
Yeah.
And it's associated in the user's mind with the message, not with a folder.
Yeah.
It's something
So-
like you said, remember to reply to Dad tomorrow, and then a second annotation that's maybe...
When you say that, though, that's not a real use case.
It is.
Like,
I wish I could do this all the time, but I don't have a mail client that supports it.
So this is DKG. I just wanted to point out that it may not just be a string, right? It may be an actual structured object, right? So I want to apply to this tomorrow might actually be a snooze button that you've attached to the message, right? So it might say, here's the timer that I want the snooze button to go off on, and it would be structured, right? I'm working on a mail user agent that has structured, that has, there's like it's a key value pair that I want to attach to every message. And so an annotation is unlike a mailbox in that sense, in that it may be a structured object. And I don't know whether the annotations we're discussing here are actually JSON objects or whether they are literally just strings. I'm hoping if we're going to do annotations that they would be objects. Maybe that's too crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting. We didn't define what annotations are, because I was thinking there is IMAP annotate extension, which is attribute valued pairs of certain types. So there is a spec that defines it. So, I mean, it's sort of variation on the theme. So it would help probably the discussion to know which kind of objects we're talking about.
Fastmail uses per message annotations for a couple of things. Actually, we use our preview is stored as a per message annotation, and that's generated when a message arrives. We scan it, find which part looks like it's the actual body, remove as much quoting as we can to find what the important part is, and then generate a couple of hundred characters of text that will appear as the preview in the interface. And that's stored as a per message annotation. We also use it in the Cyrus synchronization protocol between servers to add extended fields. So the thread ID isn't defined in the base replication protocol. It's sent as a per message annotation, then decoded at the other end and reapplied to the data model.
Pete Resnick, to respond to some of what Ted is talking about. You'll remember that in the core document, they don't just do mail messages, right? You can do calendar objects, you can do contact objects, you could do notes, you can do all sorts of objects that are stored in JMAP land, and that a particular message might point to one of those objects or just have a string in it or anything else. I think this annotation idea is really either a string or a pointer to something bigger, and maybe it once you get out of the simple attribute value pair, you point to something outside of this particular message. What I think the reason I got up is what's concerning me is it sounds like you all are trying to come up with some way to preserve all of the IMAP semantics. And this, the semantics of keywords and the semantics of annotations are a mess because they were having to be clamped onto IMAP. And I'm not sure it's worth trying to move heaven and earth to preserve all of these semantics, because I'm not convinced that annotations and keywords work well in any current IMAP client anyway.
Alexis's keywords do work.
Whether they're sufficient is a different question.
So, okay, then let me see if I get what Pete's saying. Pete, don't go away. If we think of it this way, that which are keywords, system flags, annotations, mailboxes, whatever, are objects that are attached to the message. So you can have something attached to the message that says this is in this mailbox. You can have something attached to the message that says this is seen. You can have something attached to the message that says, remember to call dad tomorrow. I'm good with that model of it. Is that what you're trying to get across? I agree with you that they don't necessarily have to be different things.
Right, and that would make me happy, and as Ned appears to be continuing to type, but I'll read the first part of his message. Yes, but it would be really, really, really nice if this can be built as a proxy on top of an existing IMAP server. Mind you, I have no problem creating a UUID extension that must be supported for this to work. Beyond that, though, things get sticky. And I'm okay with this being more general and being able to point back and use the IMAP stuff. What I don't want to do is constrain what JMAP is doing in order to only do what IMAP is doing.
Yes, and that was my point, is that I think we can be compatible with the IMAP annotate extension at that level without constraining ourselves.
Yeah, Lemon again. So it really sounds like what you're talking about is having essentially, in principle, every message could have just a hunk of mutable data that's associated with it.
Multiple hunks.
The interesting part here is synchronization, whether you need to send all the hunks every single time or whether you just send the IDs and then they have a separate change string and separate be able to get updates on them so that you don't have to fetch all the hunks every time a message is touched.
That's details. We'll get to that.
Yeah, I mean,
right. If there are 50 of these hunks, we need to be able to figure out how to deal with them as separate hunks. Anyway.
Neil Jenkins. To me, the mailbox is distinct. It has different semantics, including keeping tracks of unread counts and often having pre-caged stuff on the server for getting a list, and probably be appearing in a different part of the UI on the service, indicating to the client this is a set of things you're going to show and users have categorized stuff like this. The bits that the keywords and the annotations are the bit that you could probably merge. The main reason I wouldn't merge them is just for the IMAP compatibility and the fact that we have this registry of special flags which the client can interpret.
There is space set aside in the metadata, in the annotations namespace for these keywords to sit.
Right. We can reserve as one of the annotations for keywords if that's what people prefer, I think.
So in what Neil just said, I think that doesn't preclude this message is in that mailbox can still be a piece of this metadata blob. But Neil's point is that putting something in a mailbox doesn't just affect the message, it affects the mailbox. And there needs to be something at the mailbox side that says this message is in there. Otherwise, you have inefficiencies in trying to sort that out.
This is Pete Resnick. Yes, of course, but for any kind of annotation you can think of, this one does affect the user interface in a very interesting, important way that I need notifications of changes to this in different ways. That, to me, is we spec out for the mailbox annotation, the one that indicates that it's in the mailbox, that it always pushes when new things happen, and that you spec out that annotation in a particular way. Doesn't make it not an annotation. It makes it an annotation which has semantics which I have to deal with. And we want to avoid implementation specifics driving the protocol. The data model and the protocol should be able to carry the information that I'm using this particular annotation to mean mailbox and all the things that implies. But
I'll buy that.
Right. Buy that. We have about 20 minutes left of our time slot. Looking at these threads, that all I've got is other issues. This is our last item. So that's certainly something I think we need to look at what that would mean, both for server implementers and for client implementers, and how much complexity different options might add to someone who wants to come along and do something with email without necessarily implementing everything.
Right, and then we, potentially related issue is implementation limits. If we support objects with annotations, how many of these? What the biggest associated data size? Because this does affect
Yeah.
whether people will implement and how they will implement.
This was something we spoke to people at AOL last year about the spec, and one of their major concerns was making sure absolutely everything not only had limits, but the server could tell you what those limits were. So you knew in advance whether something was likely to work. Obviously, that you might try and upload something, and meanwhile something else has already added something, and you hit a quota limit that you didn't know you were going to hit. But at least to be able to say to the server, can I put a 1 megabyte annotation on this message, and get back a no, that's not possible. We store 256 characters, like it or lump it. That there needs to be a way for the server. And I think the standard should say servers must support a minimum size of X for each data type as well, so that you can build a client and know if you stay within those limits. Servers must support fetching at least 100 messages at a time, so that you can build a client that batches in 100 messages and don't worry about it. Or you can ask, do you support fetching 1 million messages at once? Cool, I'll just stream the lot. That kind of thing.
So is there anything that people hoped we would discuss here or want to bring up? Including why the hell are we doing this, or whatever.
Joe Hildebrand. One of the things that I think Martin mentioned in passing that I want to make sure that we capture, and I put it on my list, is to take a pass through of the HTTP semantics and make sure that they're current and modern and have captured all the things that we know about.
Cool.
Neil Jenkins, I'm going to just comment on that. At the moment, it doesn't really use HTTP semantics, but using HTTP as a transform mechanism to push stuff back and forth. There are some good reasons for that, to do again with efficiency and round trips. Even with HTTP2, where you've got your persistent connection and you can push stuff down. One of the things you might need to do is back reference. So I create object A, and then I want to reference that with some change to object B. At the moment with JMAP, as long as that's all bundled in one request, there's a mechanism for referencing that thing that you've already created. If you don't have a way of actually just bundling these multiple methods calls, like a set and a set, and then you're going to have to wait for that to complete before you can send the second request. Or you have to have some other way of defining this is the end of my batch, because the server doesn't want to have to keep track of these references forever. So this is probably getting a bit technical to on the microphone. The other thing is, if you want to say, I want to make some change, and
This is Joe again. This may be a case where if you are targeting HTTP2, that there's a bunch of the aspects of that get easier because of the stuff that's already in there. So, you know, once that decision's made, it may make getting better HTTP semantics more reasonable.
Neil Jenkins. Yeah, I think we'll have to. I'm wary of making HTTP2 a hard requirement. I think I think we just have to look at what you gain from that versus, again, compatibility with. So at the moment, you can basically run JMAP directly in the web browser, and that goes back with support and how far back that goes.
What web browser do you have that doesn't support HTTP2?
Oh, none of the new ones. But again, it's like how much that's.
This is right.
Yeah.
We need to have this discussion at
how
length
much
on
is
the
going to
mailing
impede
list.
you, like whether that's going to be a problem if we want to put it over a different protocol. Maybe that's fine. I'm not saying. I'm just saying.
We need to have this discussion in detail on the mailing list, but let's think about. Excuse me. Let's not have a side discussion off the mic, please. But let's think hard about whether we are resisting change because we're resisting change, and whether we should just move ahead to the latest protocols. Think about it. No, we don't need to decide that now, but we do need to decide it relatively early in the process. Is there anything else anyone wanted to bring up? Questions we had? Did anyone not sign the blue sheet? Ah. And then pass it back to Martin. Okay, I think we may be able to give you, how many minutes is it?
There's about
15 minutes back
left.
into your lives.
This is proxy.jmap.io, which is written in Perl and talks all sorts of exciting protocols. That's my Gmail account via JMAP, proxied from IMAP. If you send an email to brongondwana@gmail.com, in theory that will come through. I have not tested it recently. Give it a go. What you will discover is that the Moose folder keeps recreating itself because my folder matching is not quite right. But this is
an open source client in this example as well, so you can just of use.
This is a not open source client. Aha, look at that, it pushed through, it arrived. And this also has my Google address book and my Google Calendar proxied through from CalDAV and CardDAV into the JMAP proxy and then speaking JMAP down. So that's available and you can go have a play with that, and the source is all open. And this is my Fastmail account directly speaking JMAP to our Cyrus backend, which again, I can scroll to a random point and hopefully it will actually load. There you go. There's a password on there. No one saw that. And again, that is speaking direct JMAP to the backend, and you'll see the same calendar because I synchronize them in from Google to Fastmail. And it loads slightly faster because it's not a slow Perl proxy. It's actually our production servers. There you go. Not that one. Those ones. And there's some links to all the things. This is all up on the meeting details for this meeting.
All right, so if there's nothing else, we are adjourned.
See you on the mailing list.
And Joe, thanks again for taking notes.
And the Perl proxy has server code built in, obviously, it has to be a server. Cyrus IMAP has a fairly complete implementation now. The only thing major part missing is get message list updates, which I keep promising to write, but it's somewhat complex because we're working on corporate folders.
Have you started to take serious on recruiting efficiency statistics comparison so since Cyrus has got stuff in code base, right?
Yep.
So you can do a direct comparison. So you're doing a search, for example,
yep.
IMAP versus over big holidays.
But IMAP, yeah, that'd be a very interesting comparison because
it's really easy to pull down the IETF archives at this point.
Yep.
In mail archive, the web access, you can just cause it to export.
Yeah. So what we're planning to do with that is throw it in this thing, which is our brand new product. Hang on, let me un-F11 this. Where are we? For some reason, this is automatically putting me in the mobile interface, which is kind of weird. But this is a mailing list tool that we want to pull the IETF archives into so that we can test